Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Welcome back to Fighting on Film, everybody. Happy New Year. We want to kick off 2021 with a bang. So I'm delighted to welcome today's special guest, historian Peter Caddick-Adams. He's joining us as we look back at that 1970s juggernaut that is Kelly's Heroes.
Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. It's so good to be here and to push off all those winter blues with what I believe to be the greatest war film ever. And I think you invited me on because I made an outrageous comment on Twitter, which is that this is the most fantastic war film. And I'm often asked, as a military historian, a professional historian, which is the best war film ever. And my comment, which I think got your response and invitation for me to come on here, was, well, you can never get a truly objective war film.
True.
That's historically accurate. So I've gone for something that's historically as inaccurate as it's possible to be, which is Kelly's Heroes, which gets me out of that sort of quandary and gives a whole load of entertainment as well. And I can't be flayed for pinning myself to something that's historically wrong because it never happened in the first place.
But there's so many other films of that ilk that you could pick. You know, there's there's Guns of Navarone, Escape
Where
to
Eagles
Athena,
Dare.
Where Eagles Dare, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's so many others. So what made you pick Kelly's Heroes?
Well, I guess it's partly to do with I was about 10 when it came out. So the sort of films you see or the books you read in your early teens are the ones that probably make the biggest impact. So I grew up in that sort of generation of Sven Hassel and Kelly's Heroes. But I mean, 1970, and that was a year for a good haul of war films that you wouldn't get today because there were so many of them. That also saw Patton, Tora, whatever we think of that. MASH, of course, which spawned the whole TV series, and Catch-22. And cinema audiences were absolutely huge, and the studios were battling with one another. And so you would have that many blockbusters and a lot more besides coming out and attracting people into the cinemas as much as possible.
Well, exactly,
Probably that was the last haul of war movies because we then, if you remember, went into that awful era in the 1970s of disaster movies, one after another.
So just coming off something you said there, Peter, about it being an influential film for you as a young man, I think my earliest recollection of Kelly's Heroes is actually having the VHS, the video, and playing it every weekend. I think I had that, and what was the other one? Great Escape, might have been Das Boot, I think. But yeah, I remember having the VHS for Christmas one year. It was in like a box set type deal.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my one was just like standalone. I think I picked up at a boot fair. And my dad was like, "Oh, you're gonna love this film." He stuck it on. I mean, most of these movies we talk about, I watched with your dad, but he was like, "It's amazing," and it's one of those movies you just keep coming back to because it's so watchable, it's so fun. It's completely unlike movies at that time that it doesn't take itself too seriously. You know, Patton's very straight-laced film, but Kelly's Heroes is it's so unique.
It's very well paced as well.
I think the point about Kelly's Heroes when it comes out is, as you've already alluded to, it doesn't take itself seriously. It's actually an anti-war movie, and that's how the script first appeared. And it's very closely related to MASH, which of course also starred Donald Sutherland and had been made just before. And of course, this is the era of Vietnam. America had already sent tens of thousands of young men to Vietnam, an unpopular war with conscription. Nearly 35,000 Americans have been killed in Vietnam by the time Kelly's Heroes comes out. And what you've got unashamedly, as you have in MASH a bit, is a setting of a different conflict, but making a political and social comment about the war that was going on when people actually saw the film, which is Vietnam. So you could make a protest without it being overt or political. And of course, MASH is set in Korea. Kelly's Hero is set in the Second World War, but they're making the same point about being anti-military. It's more veiled in Kelly's Heroes because the script underwent huge revolutions, really. And Clint Eastwood at the end said he was not happy with the film as it came out because it didn't match in any way the script that really attracted him and got him to sign up for the movie.
Written by Troy Kennedy-Martin, who also wrote The Italian Job, I believe.
And Z-Cars.
This is the key. Troy Kennedy-Martin is the man who gets the whole project off the ground, and he had just written The Italian Job, which had come out the year before. And in a lot of ways, you've got a very similar concept for a script of a heist, taking lots of gold. In a lot of ways, you've got a very similar idea for the script, robbing a bank in an unexpected way and waltzing off into the sunset.
Stealing from someone who, can be stolen from. So you have the mob in one and the Nazis in another. So, they're acceptable Robin Hood-esque sort of almost institutions to be stealing from.
I mean, as Kelly's Hero says, it's the perfect crime because you're going behind German lines to steal gold. And we all know the Germans were great robbers, the Nazi Reich was. So you're taking something from them that wasn't theirs in the first place. You're removing it from behind German lines, and then you're just disappearing. So, A, they can't complain, and B, you're intending to disappear into the sunset with something that nobody knows anything about. And, it's got all the elements, really, of a wonderful fantasy, and that's what sells it. It doesn't have to be too serious. And the original script had no deaths in it. And of course we get 3 of them killed in a minefield. That was never part of the original caper, just like no one gets hurt in The Italian Job. But it's written by a Brit. Troy Kennedy-Martin's a Brit. He's born in Scotland, grows up there, and he's best known for Z-Cars.
Yeah.
Now, how on earth a brain comes up with Z-Cars, and he wrote The Sweeney along with his brother. How you go from those to The Italian Job, you can sort of get, because you've got wonderful people like Michael Caine and Noel Coward, but to then go to in such an American movie like Kelly's Heroes is, well, sheer genius.
And there you go. That's sort of production in a nutshell, really. I still think it's amazing that it comes from a British writer. I think if we go into the cast a little bit now, Clint Eastwood, he's your top billed star at the time. He's coming off Rawhide. He obviously as well, Fistful of Dollars, massive spaghetti western star. He's your main man. He sells the movie. But then you've got this. It's such a rich tapestry of a supporting cast. Dom Rickles, who plays Crap Game, their quartermaster. Telly Savalas, who from Battle of the Bulge. He's in it. He plays Big Joe, Sergeant. Donald Sutherland as Oddball, everyone's favourite crazy tank commander. Carlotto Alberti, who plays the only German character of any note in the film, the Tiger Commander right at the end. So it's a real smorgasbord of big stars from that time.
I mean, Carlotto Alberti doesn't have a name in the film. He's the German tank commander. He's never... in terms of characters, they are. It's funny that they were originally written as much deeper characters, and they come across in the film as perhaps as not as deep and more cardboard than you might have thought. But they've all come from a similar sort of role. So Clint Eastwood has come with Brian Hutton, the director, from Where Eagles Dare, which they both played, and had come out a couple of years beforehand. Donald Sutherland and Telly Savalas have been in The Dirty Dozen together, which had come out in 1967, so 3 years before. And Carlotto Alberti is the archetypal German, sort of big fleshy lips and sort of blonde hair. And he's really been in every sort of war movie all the way through the 1960s. His first German was he captured Richard Attenborough in The Great Escape.
Of course,
but he was there in the Battle of the Bulge. He was also in Devil's Brigade. He's in Battle of Britain, which had come out the year before. In Is Paris Burning is another one he'd been in. So he's the absolute go-to stereotypical German, and that's exactly what they need here. Some of these characters are really well known. So Don Rickles then was a really, really big name, no longer with us, and
very big US
perhaps
comedian,
not so well remembered. And the same with Carroll O'Connor, who plays himself as the general chomping his cigar. So all of these characters at the time were known quantities. And of course, we've got this wonderful script. And then we've got the director who's already produced the biggest blockbuster for MGM Studios, which is Where Eagles Dare.
Yeah.
And I think what's happening here is MGM are trying to repeat the success of Where Eagles Dare with a different cast, a far more American cast. And of course, what you've got in Where Eagles Dare is pyrotechnics aplenty. You've got, nobody runs out of ammunition famously. There's endless explosions, Germans falling off towers and downstairs. And you've got that writ large in Kelly's Heroes. And it's a sort of rerun using the same formula to try and repeat the success.
It has that comedic element as well, though, doesn't it? It sort of replaces the more grandiose and perhaps seriousness of Where Eagles Dare with a little bit more humor. And I think that comes a lot from the cast. Obviously, from what Peter was saying, that they all knew each other in one form or another, so they'd all either been with each other on screen or possibly knew each other anyway. Add to that a good script, and you have and a very good cavalcade of supporting character actors. You've got Harry Dean Stanton in the squad, and
Alien, Brett,
and various other really good character actors. Jeff Morris as Cowboy, and Stuart Margolin as Little Joe. They have there's all these good sort of quirky character actors that deliver really solid performances, basically just from being either present or with one or two short lines, and it gives that much broader ensemble feel than you would have the core cast.
The banter between everybody is so sort of, it rings true. You feel like they've been a squad for a while. It's kind of like Battleground that we talked about a few weeks ago. The dialogue in that is quite accurate in the sense of that they feel like friends. They feel like they know each other. And I think that it really comes across in Kelly's Heroes, sort of wisecracking. You can feel like, actually, okay, Big Joe and Kelly are friends. Crap Game and Oddball do know each other. It's sort of that really, to me, it always really helps a movie when you can see that on screen, and it really comes through in this one.
I mean, it's the genius of Troy Kennedy Martin. And I think, perhaps that's something to do with the fact that all his life, his scripts, apart from The Italian Job, are about policemen. In other words, groups of people in the uniform services putting their lives on the line. So you've got something not dissimilar going on here. And I think, there's a great maturity in the Kelly's Heroes script. Now, what's interesting is it was originally about 20 minutes longer, and MGM cut it back. Clint Eastwood sort of was upset because it robbed some of the film of its depth and its depth of characters. And that's why he agreed to do it, because he was rushed off his feet doing cowboy movies left, right, and center. And at the end, he sort of said, had I known the movie that was going to be released, I wouldn't have signed up to do it. But it was Troy Kennedy Martin's script that really sold me. But at the other end of the scale, you've got Oddball, Donald Sutherland. This is only his third film role, and absolutely nails it. Now, but again, it was almost as though the part was written for him, because it's essentially the same character he's played in MASH, and before that, the same character he played in The Dirty Dozen just sort of 3 years earlier. And he's always said he absolutely loved the script. He didn't have to ad-lib at all. And of course, that just launched him onto, the star he's always been ever since. There's so much that's complete about it. You've got a great director who trusts the cast. The cast all interact extraordinarily well with one another. And there's another little sort of snippet. You mentioned Jeff Morris as Private Cowboy.
Yeah.
Now, he pops up in my other most favorite ever movie, which is not a military movie, which is, of course, The Blues Brothers. And he's
fantastic.
Bob's country bunker. And, of course, that's directed by John Landis, who is one of the set directors, one of the assistant directors on Kelly's Heroes. And that's really where John Landis cuts his teeth. And I love that sort of synergy because to me, it's ticking all the boxes of all my favourite movies. And you can see the progression from one to another. And of course, John Landis later produces An American Werewolf in London, completely wacky, sort of surreal gothic horror film. But the idea comes when he's driving through Croatia, and we'll come on to that in a second, where the whole thing was filmed. And he sees a guy being buried, covered with garlic and all sorts of things. And this guy is actually meant to be some kind of vampire werewolf. He's buried with all the crosses and everything standing upright in a hole in the ground. And he says to his driver, "What's going on here?" And he's told, "Well, people actually believe here in the evil eye and all the rest of it." And that's where the whole, John Landis's brain starts ticking and eventually ends up with a werewolf in London. So as with so many things, this film is the culmination of some, the beginning of others, and is not just a brilliant concept in its own right, but is actually a really important footnote in filmography in the latter half of the 20th century. The deeper you dig, the more you find.
Very true.
Very true.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point to jump off and perhaps give a brief overview of the plot.
Yeah, I've got I've dug up from the archives a Daily Mirror review from the 17th of September 1970, and I think the first few paragraphs of the review really pins down the plot. So I'll read it out. Who's never dreamed of pulling off a perfect crime? Clint Eastwood and a bunch of tough soldier buddies actually carry out the perfect crime in Kelly's Heroes. All one can do is to stand back and gape with envy at their luck and sheer brazen audacity. Their objective is to raid a bank behind enemy lines, which is stuffed with gold bars. And that's your plot. Kelly has this mad idea that there's some Nazi gold deep behind enemy lines, and he's going to go and take it. And he assembles this ragtag bunch of troops to go and do it.
Now, it's so simple, and that's what makes it so perfect. And what's really interesting is this didn't do so well at the box office when it came out first. It's become a cult, and we love it to bits now. But it didn't quite make the dollars it was expected to when it first came out. And that was one of the accusations made against it. The plot is too flimsy. It doesn't go anywhere. How on earth can you keep a movie going for as long as you can with such a simple plot? And there's, and if you don't like pyrotechnics and Germans falling off tanks and all the rest of it, then it's pretty tedious. So some of the highbrow critics at the time really didn't get on with it. And of course, what's happened is it's gathered this momentum, particularly because of the excellent one-liners that crop up all the way through the movie, and we've come to love it. And of course, it in slow time, it's been a slow-burning fuse for MGM and its successors, and it's been extraordinarily successful. But actually, the plot was the focus of some of the critics' ire at the time. But good question. Where's the idea come from? And I'm often asked, is there any basis in fact in this at all?
I've heard something or another that it could be based on something, but I'm not too sure. Matt, do you know anything about? Is it based in truth?
Yeah, it's reputedly based on a supposed liberation of some gold reserves in Bavaria at the end of the war that involved an American unit and some local German civilians, but there's a whole sort of cloak and dagger element around it where it's sort of been buried and no one's too sure what's true and what isn't. And I think there was a sort of US government investigation into it at one point into how much of it's truly based on that. Of course, the film takes place in northeastern France because it's the 35th Division's push towards Nancy's in the film. I mean, Peter will know far better than I where the 35th Division and the 1st SS Panzer Division were in late 1944.
And a bunch of 6th Armoured Corps lads.
Yeah. But there is supposed to be some sort of truth behind it. But how Troy Kennedy Martin heard about that, I don't know. So maybe it's something that people have sort of like linked to it later on because the story's so.
I mean, I've got a couple of hunches. I mean, there is a 35th Division. It was fighting in and around Nancy in the summer of 1944, so that's all right. The 6th Armored Division eventually ends up in Europe, so Oddball could indeed have been part of them. So, yes, there's a lot of German gold salted away at the end of the Second World War with the assistance of unnamed American officials and American servicemen and German bank officials. And this is, millions and millions of dollars in gold bars and coin that is hidden in mines and other places. And although huge amounts are uncovered by Patton's Third Army in various salt mines in Bavaria and Austria, places like Merkers, uncovered in February, March, April 1945. Not all of it is ever accounted for. There's a series of books which come out in the 1970s called inevitably Nazi Gold, which points you to the way a huge amount of German Nazi gold was salted away and probably ends up in American hands back in the United States. And the books with titles like that are still in print today. That's a bit nefarious, but there is some evidence that MGM wrote to various people asking for further details about this. There's a far more logical explanation, and it's one that a lot of people miss. And that is round about the time the film was coming out or the script was being written, another book had come out called The Raid. And there are 3 or 4 books about this now. And essentially, in March 1945, George S. Patton, the very well-known Third Army commander, had discovered that his son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Walters, was a prisoner of war in a German POW camp 50 miles behind the lines. And he organizes a task force of half-tracks, jeeps, trucks, and tanks to drive through, rescue his son and other senior officers in this jail, and bring them back to safety. And it happens over 3 days. It's called Task Force Baum under the captain who leads it. And the whole thing is a ghastly failure, and only about 15 men out of 300 who set off ever reach American lines. And the rest are sort of captured rather than killed, and eventually rescued. But
that sounds like it'd make a great film on its own.
The whole business about going behind German lines with your bunch of armored soldiers on a much larger scale seems to me to be the Hammelburg raid rather than the sort of rather slower fuse, more questionable story of Nazi gold being salted away. And perhaps it's a fusion of the two. But I think that's where the ideas come from.
Yeah, that's one of the things I like about the film. Like none of what actually happens. It's a World War II fantasy film, but it's none of what happens in the film is completely implausible or impossible. No. Like with later films like Escape to Athena, it's kind of ludicrous what's going on, and other films of that kind of ilk. But with Kelly's Heroes, like it's all fairly believable. A hand grenade does what a hand grenade should do, and that kind of thing.
I think that's why it stands a test of time, because you can believe that, okay, there's a bank somewhere behind enemy lines. These guys basically get an armored column effectively and force their way towards the town that the bank's in. I think, well, yeah, they could do that. They could pull that off. If the Germans at this point don't know where the front lines are and where the Americans are, then that they could slip relatively safely through and capture the gold. I mean, it never at any point to me seems sort of, oh, really? That never happened sort of thing. It actually is, okay, yeah, go on, Kelly, keep going, son.
So we're on the edge of plausibility, which is what,
yes.
makes it so attractive. And I think the other thing that certainly attracted me, all my sort of military friends, historian friends, was the fact that it looked realistic. And this is at a time when all the war movers are using the wrong tanks and the uniforms are awful and the sets are all wrong. And you've already discussed Battle of the Bulge, filmed in Spain in the middle of summer when it should have been Belgium in the middle of winter. And yet you look at Kelly's Heroes and it looks exactly like a bit of France would have looked like that summer of 1944. You've got realistic Sherman tanks. You've got the right kind of jeeps and trucks and all the rest of it. The GIs are dressed exactly as they should do with the right kind of weapons. The Germans likewise, and there's loads of Kubelwagens and half tracks knocking around in the background, and 3 Tiger tanks which look like Tiger tanks. We know they're not, but they're the designers had made far more effort with that film than with any other previous war movie, certainly of that whole decade, and that's what rings true right through to Saving Private Ryan. Today, we take that accuracy for granted, but in 1970, that was a really, really unusual thing to do, and that's why the film just sort of does it for me, I think.
I think that's why it stands up today as well, because now we're used to sort of a lot more. We're used to really high production values now, and the small down to the smallest bit of webbing is scrutinized. But now you look back at Kelly's Heroes, the only thing I could pick it up on is men having Thompsons but wearing M1 Garand rifle belts. But that's a very small thing, and I can let it go because everything else is right. Did Matt, you found out why there's Shermans and things like that in Croatia anyway? There's a real good reason for it.
It's partially to do with Stalin and Tito's rift in the late 40s, early 50s, and the US Marshall Plan kicked in, and a large number of Shermans and other US equipment were gifted to Tito and the Yugoslavian military. So that's why we end up with, I think they are M4A3E4s.
That's right. It's exactly what they are. Tito's in the middle. The West are trying to entice him over to their side. And so there's a lot of surplus Shermans of that model. And America gives a lot, or sells very cheaply a lot, to Yugoslavia, who's in the market for armor. And so this is sort of late 40s. And 20 years later, there they are in the standard infantry in the Yugoslav National Army armory, and they're already obsolete. And so they're a gift to filmmakers.
Yeah,
and that's why the film comes to be filmed in Croatia, because you've got this wealth of armor that's available for a cut price.
I mean, that scene with the column is a phenomenal scene. Where you have like 3 or 4 Shermans. You've got half tracks. You have
M8 Greyhounds. There's the GMCs, Willis Jeeps. I think there's I think there might be Yaks. I think
there's a couple of Dodge weapon carriers and ambulances and all kinds of really interesting stuff that you just wouldn't see on that kind of scale. It's like a Jane's Guide,
isn't it? It's like like opening up a Jane's Guide and like, oh look, there's a big list of American stuff and it's there. But it's really nice to see that back then there's no CGI. You can't really fake it very well. So it's just really nice to see all that American kit in one place.
I mean, what you've got if you're trying to do a movie on a budget, and every movie has a budget, is you find somewhere where you can use the local army. And that's what Battle of the Bulge had done sort of 5 years earlier, and they borrowed a division of the Spanish army. But you buy its kit or you rent its kit. And of course, they got much later models that just don't work in terms of historical accuracy. Whereas the genius was going to Yugoslavia because it not only looked right, it looked run down and how France had done in the Second World War.
Yeah, of course.
But all the vehicles, all the kit just hadn't really moved on. And you got this complete range of American stuff, but in quantity. And normally you get one tank driving into the scene. Whereas, as you said, you can have a whole column of Shermans. And that bridging unit, the scenes with the bridges. Where's all that? It all looks absolutely realistic because the Yugoslav army, essentially put aside a division of men for as long as it took to film, and they could have access to absolutely everything they wanted, and it was all 1940s vintage. I mean, what's not to like? I mean, that's a win-win all over. No other movie company really had gone to Yugoslavia before. Which luckily had just been undergoing a sort of renaissance of its own with its own film industry. So they were very keen to learn from the Americans.
Yeah, and a lot of films follow Kelly's Heroes. Like I mentioned, Force 10 from Navarone, and I think a number of other were filmed there. I think you mentioned earlier the mocked up tigers, which are T-34-85s with a really detailed, very impressive sort of like shell skin over them, over the chassis, which to my young eye, when I first watched it, I just assumed they really were Tigers. Like, you,
unless you're a spotter or you've made your airfix models of T-34 tanks and you realise the tank track is wrong, but you know, at every glance, even a close look, they tick all the boxes. And the producers there were really lucky because the Yugoslavs had just produced their biggest budget partisan movie called The Battle of Nerveta.
That's it.
And they'd mocked up several T-34-85s as Tigers for that, and they destroyed a lot of them, but they got 3 left over. So the hard work of getting a Russian tank to look like a German one had already been done, had already been seen in Yugoslav cinemas, had got the tick of approval. Those had gone across the Atlantic already. And so what you were doing was you weren't only renting the Yugoslav army, but you were also renting some of the Yugoslavs, you know, really young, nascent Yugoslav cinema industry's props, which included those 3 Tigers. I mean, absolutely brilliant. You know, for a lot of purists, those really make the film because they stand out for, I mean, it's not for another 20, 30 years people are making any effort to get accurate German armor in any film. And so that's another reason why the movie stands out.
Yeah, and they're the villain, aren't they? For me, they're the movie's only real villain.
I mean that's the point. I mean, so much of Kelly's Heroes rests on the kit, not just the people. And, you know, none of the Germans, as we said, have got any names. And there's only one part that sort of leaps out at you. So it's the kit that makes it. And that's why the kit's got to be so good. But on the American side, too, you know, it carries you along. And, you know, occasionally they fudge it where the kit's deemed to be peripheral, like the plane that dives down, which is, you know, playing a role of a P-47 or something.
And
it's actually a sort of twin Yugoslav trainer with a rough paint job put over it. So occasionally they give up on the authenticity, like the crowd scene right at the end, where the 1960s garb. But it sort of doesn't matter because where it really, where the plot focuses on what you can see, they make the effort and get it right every time.
I think those scenes add a little bit of charm too.
Yeah.
You know, the crowd at the end dancing with baguettes and such. In case you forgot, the film was set in France. Those baguettes really bring you back to it, don't they?
They do. So I think all this kit chat really leads us nicely into the alley tally this week.
So yeah, let's do the alley tally. Each week, what we try and do, Peter, is we try and pick a particular piece of kit or equipment from the film that is particularly cool and you know, really stands out. So, do you have a piece of kit from the film that stands out for you?
I was sort of thinking about this, and we've talked a lot about the Tigers. I think there are 2 things that really leap out at me. One is the set, which is Vizinada, which is the village where the battle was fought, which looks so French, but is actually 10 miles away from where I'm talking to you now. I'm in Croatia for the winter, and the little town of Vizinada, which was almost deserted at the time and is not much more populated than that now, and it just hasn't moved on. It is a dead ringer, and it works really, really well. So many films fall down because of authenticity, and there you have got something that looks like a really run-down but very old French village from 1944. And folks, you can come here to Croatia today once we're in a COVID-free world, and you can visit the place, and you would recognise it absolutely sort of straight away. The other sort of aspect really is the kit that they're wearing. We've talked a little bit about it, but generally, you know, it's so convincing. I was in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s as a soldier, and I was here for 9 months as part of the I4 and S4 peacekeeping efforts. when it was all serious. There were mines in the ground, and you didn't know whether people were going to be shooting at you, although peace was meant to have broken out. But you saw the former soldiers, and we were doing our peacekeeping bit, and it was all a bit sort of fraught, and you were working long hours in a sort of military environment. And you got a sense, really, of what war-torn Europe was like at the end of the Second World War, and how France might have been in 1944. And so the plot was really convincing, but the soldiers, T-shirts, stained, grubby, unshaven, I mean, they really looked the part. And so many war movies, everyone is sort of fresh-faced. And they've had a good scrub, and everything is neat and pressed. Not a bit of it. I mean, they really do look grubby. And Oddball, for all his 1970s hippie eccentricities, is not far removed from how a grubby tank commander might have seemed, not having washed or shaved in the field for sort of 3 or 4 weeks. To me, that really convinces. It's the way the characters are dressed, the not just their uniforms and the kit, but the way they behave and carry themselves, and the look, and then the set, which just really just sort of sells itself. That, I think, gives Kelly's Heroes a unique quality, because most other places the set is just the background, whereas with the film, this is you're there all the time. Now, when you watch Kelly's Heroes very closely, what you realise they're doing is driving round and round Visinada. So the opening scene where the mortars come down, and they're driving away with the captured German colonel, that's Visinada too. And you can start to see that the church is actually the same church. But it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter, because that's just for the sort of nitpicking, detailed purists. And the whole thing just sort of carries itself along.
I hadn't noticed it before. It hadn't occurred to me. And then Robbie mentioned that the church looked the same, and I was like, of course, literally, it's the same town that you see at the beginning, but you see it in a completely different angle and light, and it's just.
And I have to say that's what sells it, because if you go to Visinada today, that church is still there. Nothing has changed. Nothing has moved on at all. And the town has Roman origins. You can see some Roman gravestones there. It's been under sort of Venetian occupation at various times in its history. So it's been knocking around for nearly 2,000 years. And the only thing the locals will tell you of note that's ever happened there was Kelly's Heroes filmed in 1969.
Fantastic.
And that's the one thing. This tiny little settlement, I doubt there's more than 200 or 300 people who live there. That's the one thing it sells itself on, and it just hasn't moved on. Some of the buildings have been upgraded. One or two have been pulled down. I still haven't worked out where the general's house is, because I've got my eye on. I'd love to buy that and do that up.
Oh yeah, it's a beautiful house. Yeah,
that'd be fantastic. So Matt, what's your pick this week for the Alley Tally?
My pick is actually the M8 grenade launcher on one of the guys' M1 carbine.
Yeah.
Which you very rarely see. It's a bit of a niche pick this week, I'll be honest. But you very rarely see like an M8 grenade launcher, rifle grenade launcher in a war movie, especially one of that period. And it ties in again to what Peter was saying about, the kit being pretty authentic and, very, very good. And I just think that scene where the heist, the operation in the village has begun, and they're clearing out the German garrison, and they put the guy stood with his back to the wall, just simply waiting. The firing opens up. He just turns, puts a rifle grenade straight through the window into the house opposite. And it's just this tiny little scene, but it didn't have to be in the film. And the fact that they included it in the film, and they included this unusual bit of kit, it's just, I think that to me is just
nice.
My favorite pick out of all that plethora of really cool stuff that's in there.
He's got it attached to his carbine all the way through as well. Yeah,
all the way through, as they would have done. They it came in a pouch, and they could have left it on, take it off, put it on. It's but yeah, I just think it's a really nice little inclusion of a piece of kit that's really small, insignificant, didn't have to be in there, but someone thought that's cool, we'll put that in, and they did.
Someone might not even know what that was, so the armourer might not have known what it was. I'll just stick it on the end of your gun, it looks cool. But actually, no, it serves a purpose, and it has effect near the end of the movie where they do.
It does, and it's done with a flourish, but it's so short. It's just done with a flourish, and it's a soldierly flourish, because he does it in a way that's, there's no outlandish sort of like big sort of like statement made through it. There's no like massive explosion or anything. It's just something extra within that whole sort of like final sort of battle where there's a satchel charge in a house. Like, that didn't need to be included in the film, but it's a brilliant shot.
It's nice.
So that's my pick. What about you? What's your pick for the alley tally?
I was difficult in a way, because obviously it's kind of standard fare throughout the sort of the GI
difficult
fare.
But easy.
Yeah, but I went for the sheer amount of Thompsons on display. For one, you've got M1 Thompsons and M1A1 Thompsons.
Yeah,
they're correct for the year the movie's set in. But it just seems like everyone is armed with one. There's no M1 Garands. There's one M1 carbine. But I've got a little bit of headcanon theory for why this is. So Kelly's unit's going deep behind enemy lines. So they've got their tanks and they've got their half tracks, but then the half tracks are shot up and they can't use them. So they take their 30 cals with them. They seem to be carrying about 6 or 7 grenades each. I think it's because they know they're behind enemy lines. So when they get into a firefight, they've got to put down as much firepower as they can to cause maximum casualties and then get the hell out of there. So I think that's why everyone has got an automatic weapon, for just sheer firepower. And then that leads into the excellent inclusion of that Polish BAR, which is looks like one of the most heftiest squad weapons I've ever seen in a movie. It looks like an absolute beast.
Well, that was the point I was going to come on to, because you don't see BARs in many movies. If you've got a sort of squad weapon, it tends to morph into a 30 cal Browning machine gun. And BARs are sort of relatively rare, and they don't talk about them. And yet, that particular weapon has a big role. So that's something else that's unique and brought to this. The other thing is, the German weapons are right. They're not masquerading as they're not American weapons masquerading as German weapons. The machine gun in the Tiger is quite clearly an MG42, and those are pretty rare beasts.
Although it is popping through the vision slit, not the ball mount for it.
That was a bit of a stickler for that.
Yeah.
Well, we know why the vision slit was done, so you could,
exactly.
worry in German trying to work out what was going on and coming down the street. I mean, that's the other thing. You've got the juxtaposition of absolute accuracy with then the vision slit thing comes in, so you can see the puzzled Germans looking at the 3 Americans walking down the narrow street. And then you get, we've gone into fantasy land, because all of a sudden we've gone to a scene from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly as they stride down with spurs jingling, but they're not even wearing spurs.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we can suspend our skepticism every now and again with people wearing 60s hair clothing or whatever. Because the movie pokes fun at itself, and it's not even subtle, and it carries you along because there's lots of good humour there, and once you realise that's what's happening, you forgive it when it does get things wrong, and I think that's the point.
It's a brilliant scene. Just a quick mention there for Lalo Schifrin's brilliant score. Which is great throughout the movie, and in that particular scene, it's such a great sort of like homage pastiche to exactly. It's such a great pastiche and like nod to Ennio Morricone's spaghetti western scores, and
that track in the soundtrack's called Quick Draw Kelly. That's what it's called.
Oh, is it? Oh,
great! Is it? I didn't know that.
No, I didn't either. That's marvelous.
And it's straight out of a spaghetti western, isn't it? It's so good. It's so good.
It's perfect. We look back on them, whereas the spaghetti western was the sort of current genre at the time. Yeah. So it's incredibly of its time or of its moment, and all of that has lasted incredibly well. I mean, it's impossible to believe that movie came out 50 years ago, and yet it did. And yet we can understand all the reference points, not just from a historical point of view, but all those little sort of nuances, the music, the westerns. They're still current, and we absolutely get them. They're just as popular now as they were then, and that bizarrely it means it hasn't really dated.
No, I don't think it has either. I think from a moviegoer point of view, for me, I think looking at it now, because it's a simple A to B plot, and there's no like romance scenes. There's no ulterior sort of, oh god, the big evil villain sort of scenes. It's a very simple, right, we want to go and steal this gold, so let's compile everybody and go and steal this gold. You know what's happening. You know why there's a means to every scene. You know, Oddball going to get the bridge. They need a bridge to get the tanks across. You know, anything they do is to get to the end goal. So I think that's why, for me at least, it holds up today, because you can put it on. You don't even have to know anything about the Second World War, but you can understand why these men are doing what they're doing. And I think that's why it holds up, for me at least.
I mean, there's one thing in the movie that slows it down, and that's the minefield scene. And that's the one flaw I would sort of point out in it, really, because I was watching it again, trying to look at it objectively, and then all of a sudden the minefield scene sort of stood out to me. This is where they're walking through a field, and one of them treads on a mine, and two more are caught when the Germans suddenly arrive. And there are several things about that. The first was the original script was written without any deaths, and that's what attracted everyone, particularly Clint Eastwood, but everybody else. And there was some love interest to begin with. And MGM, for some reason, wanted death. They didn't want it to just be an anti-war movie subtly. They wanted it to be quite viscerally anti-war. So the death scene came in other words, the mines. Everybody objected. Brian Hutton, even the director, didn't like it, but MGM sort of forced it through. So the screen, that bit of the screenplay had to be rewritten. But what is a minefield doing 50 miles behind enemy lines in the middle of nowhere when you stop and think about it? I mean, that's just bonkers.
On just one side of the road.
Military terminology, you put a minefield to protect something and you cover it. You don't just leave it there, because the idea is people get stranded in minefields, and that's where you then fire on them. So the minefield is an obstacle. It slows people down, and while they're busy picking their way out of it or lifting the mines, you then hit them. So minefields are always covered with indirect fire artillery, or more usually direct fire with machine guns. So you don't have a minefield in the middle of nowhere, 50 miles behind the lines, with a German camp a few miles down the road. So if they hear a bang, how do they hear a bang? We don't know about that, because mines don't usually make that much of a noise. So you don't cover your minefield with a German training camp about 5 miles down the road, or jump into your trucks and go and see what's going on. So that bit just went against the spirit of the original script. But me, from my point of view as a military purist, that just rings sort of alarm bells. That bit isn't right, whereas everything else just smoothly carries on all the way through.
I think what would have been good in its place there would have been perhaps they accidentally run into a German patrol. That would have worked just as well. If they wanted to have a couple of character deaths, then they could have easily done it with they're crossing that road, and all of a sudden those German armor half tracks appear.
They could have stumbled onto the column easier.
We have to wish whether for someone to find those missing 20 minutes from a cutting room floor, because I've never seen a sort of director's cut or even heard any evidence of it. There was a scene where they find a British pilot who's been hidden behind the lines, who's come down and needs rescuing. There's a lot of development of the sort of girls that the Oddball and his tank crewmen are playing around with right at the beginning. There's a scene where Kelly and his troops encounter a lot of French girls bathing semi-naked in one of the town fountains. And the general, when we first encounter him, Carol O'Connor, is in a bed full of girls. So there's some of that is cut out, and perhaps that was sort of over frivolous. But there's more to Kelly's Heroes than meets the eye. And including the name, it wasn't even going to be Kelly's Heroes. First title was The Warriors. Then they changed it to Kelly's Warriors. And then finally it came out as Kelly's Heroes, which I think is actually the right choice. That works.
Yes, I'd agree with that. But as you were saying that, there is supposedly a scene, a fairly lengthy one, of Joe and Kelly discussing Kelly's demotion, which is hinted
right,
to.
Absolutely.
And it gives it a bit more of the anti-war twist, which is weird that the studio decided to cut that part. because you would think that would have added to the narrative that they were trying to get across with the anti-war sentiment.
Maybe they're worried about pushback from. I don't assume there's any pro-Vietnam groups knocking about in 1917 America, but maybe they're worried about like the fallout.
Perhaps it was too on the nose.
Possibly, yeah. Worried about the censor. Maybe they thought, well, if we don't cut the scene, someone will ask for it to be cut anyway from higher up. So you never know, do you? Really, with these things, it's sort of, it could be anything while they cut that scene.
It may have just jarred completely with the tone of the rest of the film. It was too serious. Yeah, no, I think if you could cut the minefield scene out and perhaps reinsert that scene, you might have quite possibly a more interesting film.
Because they can run into that patrol anyway. Because they're going to run into that patrol, the armored.
Yes, you could quite easily. We're getting into sort of like a fighting on film, sort of like recut of the movie here. But you could quite easily cut just as they're climbing out of the minefield, have the column sort of like appear. But yeah, anyway, so we're digressing there onto a fan cut of the movie.
Well, of course, and as we do come out of the minefield, there's then that scene when they are cruising back behind the lines, all aboard the one remaining tank, and that's how they get eventually to Claremont. And there is a scene where the tank goes around the corner, and there are 3 nuns crossing the road, and that is the cameo appearance of John Landis, because he is there as one of the nuns.
Yeah, he's one of the nuns. It's so weird, isn't it? And I talked about it earlier. I want to say, I think for me now, whenever I watch Blues Brothers, I'm going to assume Bob's Country Bunker was bought with Nazi gold. That's what I'm going to assume.
Well, I love it. There's the instant connectivity from one to another. I'd love to go down in history, as credited as third nun in Kelly's Heroes.
That would be fantastic.
It's probably John Landis's proudest.
Yeah, it must be
screen credit. Maybe not directorial credit, but probably his favorite screen credit.
It's got to be. I think this leads perfectly into. We talked about some bits we didn't like, so maybe we should talk now about our favorite parts of the film.
I think my favorite part, perhaps it's a little bit of an obtuse pick, would be. I think it's the part where the 3 Shermans are about to emerge out of the tunnel into the railway yard, about to go onto the bridge, and Oddball is sat on his tank and he's talking to his other 2 tank commanders, and he's saying, "We'll go out in an echelon. I'll flank forward. You flank right. You flank left." And he's being a tank commander and a troop commander, and he's basically giving orders to the 3 Shermans. And it's at that moment that for me, I think, wait, he's Oddball. He's a screwball. He's a hippie. But he's still he's a professional. He knows what he's doing, and he knows how he's going to fight through this stockyard up onto the bridge. And I think that's a really cool bit. And of course, that scene where the tanks emerge out of the tunnel and just lay waste to that stockyard, the railway yard, it's just a really brilliant scene. You have, there's so much kit on display there. You have the three Shermans. They're playing music through their loudspeakers. You've got Oddball.
It's almost Apocalypse Now
his orders through, and there's a lot of German
diorama. You've got a steam engine there. You've got a little German quadruple 20mm anti-aircraft gun.
Yeah,
there are 14 different stuntmen in that scene. I mean, that's where they've gone to sort of. They've got their Where Eagles Dare shopping list out. Or how many pieces of kit can we cram into one pan? How often can we destroy them? How much destruction can we get for our money? And how many people can we have sort of being blown up? And there's no blood. There's absolutely no blood. You see people falling down, but you never focus on the dead at all. And the implication is they've been killed, but you never see it.
I don't think I've ever seen so many close-up coaxial machine gun shots in my life.
That's another good point. Like the close-ups of the crew inside the tank is something again that you don't really see.
Yeah. You never see that in anything else.
No, I mean, I think that the only other film I've seen that there's a couple of really bad ones in Battle of the Bulge, but there's I think that the shot of Moriarty on that Browning, the Hull Browning, and some of the others
he's
inside
gritting his
the
teeth,
tank,
isn't he? Giving it some,
yeah. Like I think they're some of the best, like in internal shots of a tank crew in action
That shot
until you
echoes,
sort of like get to Fury.
Yeah, it really echoes Fury, doesn't it? That interior shot there. I mean, it's only maybe like a 5-second clip, Matt.
Yeah, it's a very short shot.
You could side beside them, especially when I think it's the young lad, the replacement, he finally opens up and guns down that German running away, I think. But those shots are very, very similar. And I wonder if there might have been a little bit of...
There's homage from one to another, quite clearly. You see that. And you get this a bit later on in Kelly's Heroes. There's a wonderful shot of the Tiger tank blowing something up, and the camera again goes inside the tank because you see all the debris being thrown at the camera lens, and that's very unusual because you want to blink and duck as all the sort of stuff comes towards you. And again, they've had some great fun with sort of camera angles there. I think thought long and hard about the accuracy.
Gabriel Figueroa, the cinematographer for the movie, actually was nominated for an Oscar a couple of years beforehand. So you can tell that cinematography, the camera work, the shot makeup is all really, there's some really beautiful shots. There's that shot of Maitland as he walks into the bank, and it's sort of like a pivoting overhead shot of him looking through the building, and it's just a shot of the empty floor where all the gold has disappeared from. Or that shot of the Germans opening up with an MP40 from behind the tanks in the rail yard, and there's a beautifully framed shot of where the BAR's been set up, looking through a shuttered window.
Oh, and then
it's beautiful.
Just really beautifully composed shots, and and I think that's for me is probably what adds to sort of the timelessness of the film, in that it's just really beautifully shot.
So Robbie, what about yours?
Well, for me, I'm going to be cheeky. I'm going to pick two favourite bits. So my first is for me the first proper gun. I say proper, but the first proper gun battle of the movie where they take on the German trucks and the Kubelwagen when they've just come out of the minefield. And the reason I like it is because it's really up close and personal, like CQB action. You get some real nice shots of Kelly giving it some with his Thompson and things like that. But it's the fact that I think it's about 10 men. I think I counted them as 26 fully armed Germans there with MG42 support, and they absolutely lay waste to them. And I think it's more the shots of, for me at least, Don Rickles with a 30 caliber machine gun. In my head, I'm like, that's Mr. Potato Head giving it some with a 30 cal. And for me, I'm like, wow, it's great. But it's when I was little, that scene, I always loved it. So I thought, oh, come on, they're gonna shoot that column up now. It's just such it's her not fun, because obviously, shooting another man isn't fun, but I mean, sort of in a sort of action movie way, gun ho, over the top action. It's really well done, and I always love it. Yeah,
those Thompsons are doing what those Thompsons were designed for.
Yeah, up close and personal, sweeping shots. It's brilliant. And then my second is it's just Oddball and Moriarty's relationship. I just love it. And I've got an extract.
Foil, yeah.
Oh, I've got an extract from one of their conversation, and it's when Kelly is sort of saying, right, we're going to go into the town and we're going to take on the Tigers, and then we're going to get the gold. And Moriarty just explodes, and he says, when we was in the Bocage country, we were assaulted by them Tigers. You know what I mean? Assaulted. And Oddball goes, why don't you knock it off with them negative waves? Why don't you dig how beautiful it is out here? Why don't you say something righteous and hopeful for a change? And Moriarty just goes, crap, and he walks off. And I adore that. I love it's such an insight into their relationship, because you find out, from one word, I'm like, oh God, they've been fighting since Normandy, they must really love and hate each other. And when he introduces him, he's like, oh yeah, this is Moriarty. You can do anything with a Sherman engine. He goes, oh, whatever you say, babe. I'm just like, what's their relationship? They sort of love each other. They hate each other. It's just brilliant.
That feeds into one of the best lines of the whole thing, because almost next, Oddball is sort of being nudged to play his part and be a hero. And he turns around. To a New Yorker like you, a hero is some kind of weird sandwich. I just love that. It is just such a surreal phrase. And that's why the film just never dates, because these stabs in it, I mean, Troy Kennedy Martin must have been rolling in the eyes, sitting down, coming up with a brilliant line like that. And
So
that
good.
is, I mean, it works on both sides of the Atlantic, but it's timeless. I mean, you could have deployed that line 100 years ago and people would know it. You'll be able to say that line in 100 years' time, and it will still mean what it meant in 1969, 1970. That's why I love it. That scene is brilliant, because they're talking tactics. They're doing what military folk do. And, Clint Eastwood Kelly is coming out with, okay, this is how you work. This is the floor of a Tiger tank. It's hemmed in. So how are we going to get round it? So it's not all, it's not all fantasy. It's anchored down. It's really clever screenwriting. Which would have appealed to an audience, a lot of whom were undergoing an American conscription to fight in Vietnam, or the slightly older ones who'd fought in World War II. And half the cast are too young to have fought in World War II, but some of them had. And therefore their audiences had. So, this has got to be actually not just have the right kit, but actually talk the talk and be vaguely realistic.
Yeah.
And again, it ticks all the boxes. And that particular scene where they're overlooking the town, Claremont, they're about to go in and they're working out how to do it. All tactics bits just hit the nail on the head for me, just as we've said with the three tanks. Let's go out in arrowhead formation, and they all know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I love it for that.
They're soldiers that have been all the way through France, so they're going to be experienced. They're going to know the best way to sort of tackle these things. So it's nice that the film and that the writing gives them those legs, because they hint they've been in the bocage. They hint that they've fought through France. Kelly's a demoted lieutenant. It's just all these small little things that sort of like rounds out the characters and gives them that little bit of backstory and depth. I think it's
great.
But yes, Peter, please, what's your favorite?
Well, I'm just picking up your last point. So soldiers, when they work together for long periods of time, particularly in combat, should be able to sort of spark off each other and almost understand what their colleagues want them to do without having to explain. And of course, in Hollywood terms, that doesn't work. And that's where you're odds with reality. So what's the device you bring? You bring in two groups who are on the same side, but they haven't worked together before. And so Oddball and his tank crew, they all know what they're about, but Kelly doesn't, because his group haven't been past them. So that's how you get the cinematic sort of device of each explaining what the other's doing, because they're strangers to each other. So that particularly works well for me. I mean, I'm going to cheat, just sort of say, well, what carries it along for me is Oddball. And I put a poll up before this podcast. 640 people responded to my poll, which was who's your favorite character in Kelly's Heroes. And I put up Big Joe, I put up Oddball, I put up Kelly, and I forget who the other one was. And the overwhelming vote was by 65% was Oddball. So in people's minds, it's he who carries, Donald Sutherland, who sort of carries the film. And it's what makes him, it's his one-liners. We've just had a look at one of them. But it's interesting, Oddball doesn't appear until 31 minutes into the film.
Yeah.
And what's his first line? Can you remember?
Gosh.
He's out of shot.
Yeah.
And it's something like...
a Sherman can give you a very nice edge.
Yeah. Is that it?
No.
Oh.
You could probably use some armor.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Immediately preceding that, yeah.
And it's that he's out of shot. It's so unexpected. It's so left field. And that sets the movie. It's not predictable. None of the characters are really predictable. You think you know where it's going. And Oddball is the oddball because he bowls at you left field all the time. And whether it's his phraseology or his behavior, and that's the whole script. It takes you all over the place. And none of the destination, none of the sort of adventures are really expected. And I think that's That's the other thing. It gives you a genre that you've never encountered before because it's pure surrealism. No accident that this is coming out in at the height of the sort of surrealist era in the 1960s, 1970s. It's very avant-garde in that respect. So that's Oddball, just after half an hour. And then, of course, at 53 minutes, we've got Don't Hit Me with Those Negative Waves So Early in the Morning. And, these have given rise to endless imitations. Whenever I put up on Twitter, which I seem to do almost every day, the fact that I love Oddball, there's always a Negative Waves comment. Are you sitting here, drinking wine and eating cheese?
Oh, that's such a good quote. I was just thinking of that one. Well, as soon as we put up that we were going to do Kelly's Heroes, we got a flurry of quotes of just people replying to the tweet, just quotes. And one of them was the New York sandwich line. And it brought it back to me, instantly. I thought, there's so many good lines in this movie. And woof woof.
Yeah.
It's bizarre.
I
and
love
it's
it.
completely sort of like out of the time. No one in 1940 probably would have, had the mannerisms and that kind of speech that Oddball does.
Why don't you dig what a beautiful day it is? I mean,
exactly.
That's just not 1940s language
at
all.
Yeah. You wouldn't have that in
Battleground.
Battleground.
It doesn't matter. That's the whole point. And this is why, it does. So the other thing, I mean, the script sums up moods in the wrong language. There's a lovely scene where the Sherman tank is broken down in Claremont, and Oddball is just sort of sitting around, and Kelly says, old Big Joe says, why aren't you fixing it? Hey man, I just ride them. I don't know what makes them go.
Yeah,
and
I ride them and I'll fix them.
You talk to any cavalry officer around the world, and that sums up their view. They sit on their tank, they command it, they have no idea how to get the greasy engine to work or anything else.
Yeah.
Or that's the wannabe attitude of the cavalry. And it just sort of it captures that mood. And I think for me, what sells Kelly's Heroes so well, having worn uniform for a lot of my life, is it's so popular with the military because it takes all those stereotypes, it exaggerates them. And yet, with every character in Kelly's Heroes, you've got a lot of soldiers, male and female, sitting around of a lot of armies all right across the world, and they're nodding sagely. I know that character. I know that character. I know the sort of person who would say that. And again, I think that's why it appeals, because it's only one stage removed from reality, and that's why it works. It was it's close to the bone, and yet it doesn't seem so because it's poking fun and it's so exaggerated and serious. But on another level, it's incredibly close, and that's the genius of the script and perhaps the mood of the time.
I mean, we wax lyrical about Oddball and the gang. Eternal. He will always be the Sherman tank commander, I think. But
far more professional than people think.
Yeah, much more. So any final thoughts, chaps, on Kelly's Heroes? I mean, we could literally be here all night on it, but
yeah, I think for me, the reason it's so timeless and so enjoyable is a combination of a great script, performed by a great cast, shot beautifully, I think, and it's in a beautiful location as well. That Croatian village that Peter's told us about is really beautiful, and it's the perfect sort of echoing those Mexican or Western American towns in cowboy films and spaghetti westerns. Has that echo, and it also has that echo of what a French village in 1944 might have looked like as well. So it has that perfect setting, brilliant cast, great writing, and it's beautifully shot. So they're my final thoughts on Kelly's Heroes.
Peter?
I think Kelly's Heroes delivers in a very military way with some of the characters. So Kelly is a leader. He puts his life on the line. He's on top of the tank when they go into Claremont. He's kidnapping German colonels behind the lines. I mean, he's the sort of guy you would want to follow over the top. You've got Big Joe, who's the guy who worries about the people. He doesn't want them to go on the bank raid behind the lines because it's going to kill everybody. And eventually he's talked round. But he is the
good
edge.
NCO.
He's worried about the personnel. And you've got Crap Game. He's the supply guy. He's the guy who organizes all the logistics. You've got all the elements there that you need for any successful caper, whether it's a heist, whether it's any kind of sort of business. You know those three elements, and you've got them extraordinarily well enacted in a sort of Second World War context. And that to me, and I'll go back to what I said right to the beginning. The best Second World War movie of all time is Kelly's Heroes, because in some ways it delivers something that's incredibly close to the bone, and yet it steps away. It's not based on actual historical truth in any way at all. But we've all agreed it's just on the edge of plausibility, and doesn't that make it a candidate for the best of all time?
Yeah,
Definitely.
I mean, it's high praise coming from you, Peter. But I think for me, I mean, it's just the longevity of the movie. You know, the fact that we're still sitting here in 2021 and talking about a movie with such enthusiasm that came out in 1970. You know, it predates me by like nearly 30 years. I was born in the early 90s. But I went online and I was just looking for some facts and things to pull up today. But the sheer amount of merchandise you can still buy for this film, for me, is incredible. You can buy a little scale miniature of the church tower that Cowboy's in. You can buy little figures of Oddball and Kelly and things like that. I think that's mad. There aren't many movies from that era who still have consistent merchandise being made for them, and not even official merchandise, just merchandise that fans have made because they love it so much. Me and Matt were sharing some alternative posters that we found, and I think I want that on my wall. It looks so cool. It just stood the test of time so well, and I think that's why, for me, it's just a fantastic film. I can't say any more on it really. It's just eternal.
I think it was the perfect film for us to come into the new year with our very first episode.
Yeah.
And I can't thank you for coming on enough, Peter. We're so pleased that you could join us to talk about the film. Your enthusiasm for it on Twitter definitely came across, and we thought we got to have Peter on to talk about this one.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for those positive waves. And I'm going to disappear off into the sunset now and drink some wine and eat some cheese. And hopefully you beautiful people will dig just how beautiful it is out in Croatia. And the moment this horrible plague has left us, you two are going to come over here, find that tiny little place near Porridge on the coast, little village called Vizinada, and share some of those positive waves, because you will see where the whole thing was filmed, and just how much fun they must have had on the set making it. And this is where I put my professional reputation on the line, having been a professional military historian for over 30 years. I still think it's the best contribution that Hollywood can make about the Second World War, because it's sufficiently divorced from reality to get me off the hook of any accusations, and yet it's sufficiently close for everybody to nod and say, God, that's pretty authentic. So there we go.
There we are. Fantastic.
That sounds like a fighting on film road trip for the future.
That would be incredible. So as ever, everybody, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Give us a like, a follow, a review on whatever you're listening on, whether that be Apple, Spotify, any of those apps. So yes, is everyone signing off again? I'll say bye-bye.
Thanks for listening, guys. Oh, and don't forget to follow us over on Twitter as well, @FightingOnFilm.
And I will say goodbye as well. Thank you very much. I've hugely enjoyed it. Thank you very much for inviting me on, guys. That's brilliant.
See you soon, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.